I think that we'll wait for maybe 1-2 more minutes and then we can start. Yes?
Perfect.
Okay, I think that we can start. I don't see anyone, but okay.
We're here.
You are here. You are there.
Imagine.
Okay. Good morning. Good afternoon. I don't know where our participants actually are based right now, but I would like to welcome everyone from Doha and from UN-OCT Behavioral Insights Hub. At the beginning of this discussion of this event, I would like to say that actually we are not new here. We were partnering with DPPA and particularly with Martin Wellish, organizing such events during the behavioral science weeks since the establishment of the hub. So the first time we partnered in 2021. So this is our actually fourth time already doing that kind of discussion together. This time we'll focus on the future of behavioral science for peace and security. And what I would like to say that this is very important for us because this is what actually our hub does all the time. So we are trying to bring together, and we are bringing together over the last 3 years, practitioners as well as academia and experts together, people who are either trying to understand better behavioral science or people who are actually doing behavioral science in the field, putting those people together in order to allow them to tailor our interventions in the context of building resilience, countering terrorism and radicalization. This time, our event will focus on peace and security, but we cannot forget that issues of radicalization, issues of terrorism are actually part of this as well. As I said, the main objective of the hub is to bridge the gap between academia and practitioners, and we are doing that. In order to do that in the best way, actually, we organized last year and we developed and organized actually the first edition of the BI Academy, our main capacity building projects that actually allows us to bring together all these beneficiary groups that you are working with for 5 days to Doha and to train them, to show them, to try to help them to develop behaviorally informed interventions in their respective areas of activities. So here we are. We will be starting our discussion, but at the beginning, allow me to introduce our speakers. And I will start from Professor Mina Cikara from the Harvard University. Professor Cikara is a leading expert in the social psychology and behavioral science, with her research focusing on intergroup conflict, aggression, and prosocial behavior. Her groundbreaking work has provided deep insights into the psychological mechanisms behind group dynamics and conflict, making her a pivotal figure in applying behavioral science to peace and security. And our second participant is actually Andrés Casas, the chief scientist at Neuropaz. Mr. Casas is renowned for his innovative application of neuroscience and behavioral science in conflict prevention and resolution. His interdisciplinary approach combines cutting-edge technology with cultural sensitivity to develop strategies that addresses the root of conflicts. His work has been instrumental in creating more effective and human-oriented interventions in the field of peace and security. I can say that actually I know Andrés personally, we are good friends, and I had pleasure to participate last year in amazing conference and workshop that Neuropaz is organizing every year in Colombia. So last year, we were able to bring together around 200 people that were listening for 3 days of people who were talking about behavioral science, about neuroscience in the context of conflict resolution and conflict prevention. So here we are. This is our beginning. Now I would like to give the floor to Martin, who will facilitate the discussion and will ask very difficult questions to our speakers.
Thanks, Maciej. Thanks for putting the bar so high up. Colleagues, good to be with you. It's the 4th year, as Maciej mentioned. Always a pleasure to run those sessions together with our colleagues on OCT. Big thanks to them for supporting us through knowledge sharing and kind of reflections over the last years. It's very exciting to think about the future of behavior science in the context of peace and security. All of us who have been looking and kind of focusing, zooming in on latest discoveries in brain and neuroscience, are excited to learn from the speakers that we have with us. And those who are total beginners, I'll make sure that there are going to be some knowledge nuggets, even if you're not holding a triple PhD in those fields. So try to keep a balance between kind of zooming in on new discoveries, but also keeping it simple as much as we can. With that said, I would love to invite Mina to join the panel virtually, so to say, and Andrés as well. So if you can turn on your camera, that would be wonderful. And I will ask both of them 5 questions to start with. And then at the very end, there's going to be time for Q&As for all of you out there to join in. There is a button in your Zoom application where you can submit questions already. That will make it easier for me as a moderator later on to pull from those questions. And those who have to leave early, big promise that we are recording that session and make this available on the known channels. So if you don't have time to stay until the end, post your question now. I will try to pick up on it, and I'll make sure that the recording is made available after that session. We have around 50 minutes left. So all in all, this is a 1-hour session just to manage our time as well. So Mina, let's start with you. Good to have you with us. We have worked closely on virtual reality, and your work, is known to many of us in the UN, especially when it comes to communal issues. And I wanted to ask you, quite frankly, how did you get into the field of behavioral science? And despite the many conflicts and the unsolved issues in humanity around us, like what keeps you still excited working on those? Over to you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Martin. Thank you all very much for the invitation to join you. This is an incredibly exciting opportunity, and I feel very privileged to be here. So the way that I come to my research is through my own life experience. I think it's a fairly common thread in the behavioral sciences that research is me-search. My family is from former Yugoslavia. My father hails from what is now Serbia, my mother from Bosnia. I was born in Serbia. I grew up in the United States. And so my family lived here from prior to the Balkan Wars. But as you might imagine, throughout the early 90s, we ended up hosting many family members who were seeking asylum and fleeing the violence. We have many extended family friends who were sort of firsthand witnesses to the atrocities that were committed on in Balkan territories. And so I would say that part of what has drawn me to this work is the understanding that oftentimes the things that bring out the worst in humanity come in service of being the best group members. And that puzzle about how our interpersonal morality gets cast aside when we are making choices on behalf of our groups and in service of their goals. That tension is really, really interesting to me. The other thing is that my early exposure in my undergraduate work to social psychology really laid bare for me that there were gaping holes in our understanding of these dynamics. So one very prominent theory in social psychology is intergroup contact, this notion that if you could just get people together, get them to get along, that would reduce prejudice, that would somehow, I don't know how much more intergroup contact you can have than former Yugoslavia, people raising each other's children, marrying across religious boundaries and ethnic boundaries, and yet still it falls apart into the bloodiest genocide on European soil since World War II. So those things for me really are how I came to the study. And I guess what keeps me here is that there is never any lack of problems to try to address and solve. And so I guess job security, for better and for worse, is but also hopeful that we can collectively do better going forward for ourselves and for our children.
Yeah, and thanks for fleshing out the curiosity you have as a scientist, to keep going, because, as you described, apparently we haven't figured it out. If we had figured it out, the world would be indeed the better place. And thanks also for sharing kind of your personal story. Research is me-search, and probably goes out to many of us when it comes to like, why are we in the UN? Why are we caring about international issues? Andrés, you live in Colombia, studied in the US. I would say you're a citizen of the world, knowing you a bit as well. What got you excited about behavioral science, and why you're still in that field? Disregard, the many pitfalls and kind of drawbacks as well.
Okay, thank you so much. It's great to be here, and especially, being with you guys who are doing the work out there every day. And I'm celebrating, I think this is the third year, if I'm correct, of this event happening. And I think it's really important. And in particularly, I believe like people like Professor Cikara, who are doing like this groundbreaking work have, resonated with us, who and when I say us, it's all humanity, who have been touched in many ways by violence, indirectly or directly. My country is, is not an exception. And as we were saying, I remember delayed Casas telling us that, for example, the climate change is like the perfect problem in terms of the difficulties and the tension that poses for humanity. But I would say like violence, especially intergroup hostility, as we're seeing in everyday news, is like the real problem, because if we don't, in a sense, get what we know about humanity, and it's our ability to adapt and change, and how we can basically ignite these prosocial behaviors that we know we're capable of, as the professor was saying, I would say we're lost. In that sense, hope is moving us. For me as a Colombian, as you know, we underwent this peace process that is being challenged by many forces, but I think I've been working hand to hand with not only people who signed this peace agreement, who are right now working for peace in their own lives, against big challenges, but also with people around the world who are trying to basically keep hope alive, particularly in these times where basically trust on the possibility of supporting peace and prevention. A lot of people think it's lost, and we are seeing that in electoral processes. We're seeing that in the way we are encountering dissent around the world, etc. So I think this is the perfect time. And again, just talking about Colombia, what keeps me going is that we managed to keep hope alive, to understand that peace is the best way. And in a sense, this is like a journey that humanity we shared, and we need to basically understand that there's an alternative to having this suffering going on. And if we work together, even though it sounds like naive at this time, we can get to better places in that sense. And for me, this type of encounters, just to say, it's always a remembrance of Emile Bruno, who was the person who got me involved in neuroscience. And I know most of the panel interacted with him as co-authors and as people that basically try to forward the idea that can we put science to work for peace around the world.
Andrés, I wanted to stay with you a bit and pull out more from the past, before we look into the future. And you just mentioned Emil's work. And I wondered whether you can share with us, one of the most exciting projects in the context of behavioral science you worked on or Emil worked on or that you have seen, just to inform our audience what has actually worked in the past. And I'm saying that because there are a lot of skeptics, especially on the peace and security side, where behavioral science is just seen as a soft skill, something that we do naturally, not really scientifically systematic. So I wonder whether you can enlighten us a bit based on, the work you have done, Emil and others in that field.
Okay, thank you. And again, going back to meeting Emil, for me, was great because I have the privilege of meeting these special humans that are unique. I was at that time studying under Professor Cristina Bicchieri. We were working a lot on understanding the role of social norms in reducing especially violence against women and children. And in that time in the University of Pennsylvania, I came across this professor who had this very nice and cool class called Peace Science. And I was wondering, okay, that's great because, I grew up like learning in political science and being trained also in public policy, how we can take science to the field and make, in a sense, a peace work. And in that sense, I met Emil and I met him in his office. He was a really, really down-to-earth guy. I saw like these incredible publications. He was really young and he was doing this exciting work, basically to get the lab on the field and especially to get people together around translational research, trying to get the research to work for decision makers, but specifically to bring protagonists in the center or at the front of what we do as scientists. So I met Emil and he basically challenged me. He told me, okay, you're from Colombia, so please explain why people vote against peace in their own country. And I was like, oh, great question, right? Easy to understand. And from the political science or political psychology side, and using comparative politics, you would say, okay, it's easy, right? It's basically, like political orientations. So in Colombia, we lived throughout 60 years of war. We had we were exposed to these ideas about who the good guys and the bad guys were. And basically people didn't want the bad guys to, in a sense, be pardoned and forgotten for everything they did throughout the 60 years. That was the story, the narrative, right? But Emil told me, okay, but what if there's something else, right? Especially what is underlying these political orientations, and especially why people would prefer to keep or continue war and not trying to go into a peace agreement. And obviously there are other common places. The standard thing would be like, it's not rational basically to trust these people. Then, the history of 14 at least or more civil wars in my country, and then many agreements that didn't work out, especially because of the violence that relapsed very quickly after a peace was signed, and factions and set out these dynamics that we know in political science work. But we brought in the question about, okay, let's ask for other things. And especially we found out, going out to the field, meeting the people who signed the peace in the demobilization camps, talking to the people in the big cities who were basically the ones who were opposing reincorporation and reintegration of these combatants. We learned that it was not just trust. There was something going on. And we brought in some of the work, like Professor Cikara have been working for many years, and Emil's work of their own on humanization or dehumanization, meta-perceptions, other categories that normally were not measured in Colombia. And we found out especially that people basically didn't have like their theory of mind working basically on the right place, because we thought that the FARC members were not human. That was the main learning that we had throughout the survey that we did using these more kind of implicit measures, right? Rather than going for the usual knowledge, attitudes, and practices that we usually survey people with. So we learned about that, and basically the mechanism will be like the expected protagonist here would be empathy, right? What's going on with empathy? But we understood that empathy was not playing a part here because you don't basically, you know, project your humanity to people that are not human, or basically not to people, but to the enemy, right? So we started, you know, going out to the field. We spent 6 months with a cinematographer and, you know, with Emil also coming several times to that part of the country, spending 6 months with these communities, with their previous, you know, enemies or people who were victimized by their presence because they basically demobilized in the same place. So it was like the perfect situation to understand these dynamics. And we understood that the things, even though they seem to freeze these basically cognitive and emotional mechanisms that help us basically deal with every day and to basically navigate life, we understood that they can be changed. And we found that using interventions, especially trying to use parasocial contact, because people won't be incentivized to meet with the enemy, and most Colombians live in cities, and these people were, you know, in the countryside, we basically use the power of narratives to show and present people in a, you know, in their humanity, and then try to use the social proof mechanism to show that communities could present their previous enemies as trustworthy, new possible cooperators and people that they were, you know, playing soccer with, building roads, starting doing some, you know, like entrepreneurship and so on. So in that sense, we understood that if we can understand where to put the money, where to put the effort, and understand that messaging could backlash, so we need to test and pilot first what people would receive. We tested through this intervention tournament that we did for 3 years. And we managed to do a panel of people, basically, and then replicated this several times. And we saw that specifically meta-perceptions can work specifically to open a road to change the way people see other people. First, to present them as humans. You know, we understood that people were avoiding the pain of the others because we know in this situation, there's competitive victimhood going on and other mechanisms that wouldn't allow your mind to project basically your humanity to others, but this can be reversed if we see what people are already doing for peace, trying to understand that these social expectations really work in this moment, and if we can confirm, because we were fed up with propaganda from the people who were vetoing the peace process, that were telling us that ex-combatants were living, you know, their great life in these big condos and, you know, having the time of their lives. And we got there, they were living in very, very difficult conditions without support and etc. They were really, you know, trying to rebuild their lives in a very difficult context. So we understand that presenting that capacity, malleability, and then presenting the social proof and finally getting authorities around them, like professors, like people in the church, to confirm was the perfect remedy. So for me, that was the great work we did with Emil here, and we basically are extending that work to other topics.
Andrés, thanks so much. And, you know, let me just unpack this for our audience, you know. So 2 big elements here. One is, you know, the thorough process of testing, observing, measuring, you know, so that's kind of one thing you described. And a panel, for instance, would be a group of participants that you can test messages out, social messages, public messages, you know, public communication, for instance, go vote or lay down the arms, etc. So that's kind of the process part. And that's often in contradiction to how many programs are run, where the evaluation comes in the very end, right? But the testing is not, there's not enough time and money spent throughout and at the beginning to run programs. That's the first thing I heard from you. And the second one was really to have a thorough diagnostic, right? Where you talked about elements like meta-perceptions. So meta-perceptions are how I think the other side perceives me, right? Which then leads to clashes because we have all those assumptions, right? We perceive that the other side doesn't like me, or takes things for granted and so forth. So how do we shift those meta-perceptions? And then another category for the diagnostic you mentioned was, for instance, dehumanization, right? Where the perpetrator is often perceived by the victims as the monster, the killing machine, not human anymore, right? And you gave us an example of how through social interaction, journeys together, one would see the human again in the other side in order to connect. Now, Mina, over to you. And you have, produced a lot of this knowledge in the lab and also in the field. What's your favorite example from the past? What keeps you excited when you have to explain behavioral science in the peace and security context?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's an excellent question and exactly the right one to be asking. I would say, just as a sort of backdrop, that it's certainly not the case that the behavioral sciences of peace and conflict are somehow restricted only to psychology. I mean, I think a lot of my political science, econ, anthropology, and sociology colleagues would be shocked to hear that that's the perception, and would hope that they would also be counted amongst the people who are making contributions to the field, both in the lab as well as in the field. With respect to the work that I do, I guess the way that I would characterize it at a very high level is trying to build on what we've learned now from 70 years of the cognitive science of information processing to understand how it is that information gets distorted as it moves through the human mind, and how conflict entrepreneurs seize on those distortions in order to continue to foment and tell a particular narrative that would then support legitimacy of conflict and violence. And so, just as a few examples, even if people had perfect access to all information, it's not the case that they would necessarily have a veridical picture of the world in their heads, because we know that there's a very strong human tendency to pay more attention to, encode better, and recall negative relative to positive and neutral information. And you can imagine a whole host of reasons why that would be adaptive, particularly in past ecologies in our evolution. Other things are also biases, and these are things that have been identified by psychologists, like Nobel Prize winning Danny Kahneman, right? Availability heuristic. The more easily something can be brought to mind, the more real and likely it seems to happen. And so there are these very deep fundamental quirks of human cognition that then feed into how quickly propaganda can sort of take root in people's psychologies and influence their behaviors. Other things are that people are incredibly tuned to normative information. Andrés has just mentioned Professor Beccari's work and the deep influence of norms, and this is from the sort of econ tradition, but psychology also has a very long history of studying norms. The notion that people basically behave the way they think that they're allowed to behave on the basis of the preferences of people around them. And so if you think that there is incredibly broad support for violence against a particular entity, that's an incredibly difficult tide to swim against, even if privately that is not exactly your own attitude or preference. And so, again, conflict entrepreneurs and elites understand that there has to be a particular perception in place before we can get people on board with engaging in costly violence. Most people don't want to be violent most of the time. It's an incredibly costly endeavor. And so what people have to do, what leaders have to do, is to get people to believe that all alternative means of negotiation, of any kind of means of solving whatever conflict is on the table, are no longer an option. That the last possible resort is the only one. And so that's really where my work sits, is trying to understand how these very low-level cognitive biases feed into these things. One project of which I'm particularly proud in recent memory is this one where we look at the cognitive science of numeracy. That is how the human brain understands numbers. And so the reason that this matters for conflict is because we know that there's an incredibly important role for perceptions of mobility, immigration, sizes of migrant populations, and all these other sort of big social and cultural changes that can feed into people's concerns about symbolic threat as well as material threat. So the way that my local ecology works is going to change, or it's going to be harder for me to get along with people in my community because we don't share the same norms and values. Or maybe they're coming and I believe that they're taking our jobs, what have you. The bottom line is that across every domain in which you can possibly measure it, people have measured it, maybe we haven't measured it in the right one to find this, but across all of them, people tend to have a very stereotyped distortion of numbers, where we tend to overestimate small proportions of things and underestimate large proportions of things. Why does this matter? It matters because what that means is that even very small numbers of, say, immigrants from a particular country will be overestimated in the community. And to the extent that political elites want to use that mobility and the presence of this new entity as the means of fomenting fear, perceptions of threat, again, economic, material, symbolic, even pathogenic threat, right? Like they're bringing with them particular kinds of diseases, what have you. All of that puts people in a defensive crouch. And the power of that defensive crouch is that almost anything becomes morally acceptable if it's done in self-defense. And so this is that sort of feedback loop that I'm really interested in. And what we find is that, for example, even though people are in the United States and the UK pretty bad at estimating the proportions of different, and this is, we're specifically looking at white people, thinking about Hispanic, Black, Asian, and Arab groups in the US and the UK, even though they're pretty inaccurate in the proportions of these people in their local communities, this is at the county level or at the local authority district in the UK, they're still very good at understanding sort of ordinal ranking of those groups. So even though I don't have the number right, I know that, say, the Black community in my county is larger than, say, the Asian community or what have you. And what we find is that above and beyond the size of these groups, that rank matters for predicting things like hate crimes against those groups, as well as negative attitudes towards them. And again, this also generalizes to the UK, which has a very different demographic distribution across these groups, as well as a different history. And so all of that's just to say that I do think it's incredibly important for us to understand what these low-level cognitive inputs are, because elites can say whatever they want, but not everything is going to be equally believable. It's not going to be equally persuasive. But if you can find the right way to lock into that psychology, you can make your messaging more persuasive. You can change people's beliefs about what everybody around you thinks. And then that can then engender greater legitimacy and support for an engagement in violent behavior.
You know, that's super interesting. Let me be the devil's advocate here, right? Because what you talked about are assumptions, right? And one could argue, and I hear this often, isn't that just common sense? You know, isn't that common sense that people overestimate, and like overestimate, for instance, number of refugees, you know, migrants or unemployment rates, because there's a certain intrinsic fear. Isn't that common sense, you know? And I wonder whether you feel it's sometimes frustrating that the body of knowledge you produce as an academic, right, is not taken on from decision makers. So I wonder kind of what you argue to make the case for a more systematic scientific approach. And then still, I want to hear, why would that matter? You know, wouldn't that just confirm things that seem to be common sense? What are your thoughts on that?
I think it would certainly be news to me that that's common sense, that we had already discovered that people have log odds distributions in their head as opposed to actual proportions. But maybe that's just me being a little bit too nitpicky on the cognitive science of numeracy side of things. I guess one of the things I would also I think is incredibly important to note is that two things fall out of this project that I don't know that everybody understands as common sense. First of all, it's interesting to me that so much of the data that we have with respect to, you know, whatever state capacity is for informational capture, a lot of it happens at the level of the nation, when our effects are all happening in very, very local levels. So what matters in our data, for example, is the county, the distribution of these groups in the county, as opposed to, say, in the state or at the national level. And so when you see this work and you see these reports, you have things like, oh, well, Germany has, you know, 14% immigration, 14% of the population is immigrants. It doesn't matter at the national level because they're not distributed evenly across the geography. And that means that some communities are going to be at greater risk for conflict than others. But that sort of local variation and sensitivity to it, at least heretofore, has really been missing from the conversation on the research side. And I'd love to talk to more folks about how they're thinking about that in their own practice, because it also suggests that even when you're in the same place, in the same country, within the same state, whatever the same canton, there can be still a ton of variation from neighborhood to neighborhood. And the other thing that we know matters a lot is not just the diversity of these neighborhoods, but the segregation of them. So it turns out that these kinds of prejudices and violence are less likely to break out in those places where it's both diverse, but also people are interdigitated with how they live. So it's not just the numbers, it's also the spatial organization of them. I don't know that this is necessarily something that's totally intuitive for people. And so that's what I would say is we need systematic study of the scale of things, both the numerical distributions, but also the spatial distributions of communities, because these different communities are going to have very, very different potential for intervention, and also the longevity and durability of whatever interventions you plant there. It's also another thing, it flags another component of this, which is that people have to be highly sensitive to sorting. That is how it is that people choose to live, whether or not they create enclaves, whether or not they're, again, interdigitated or living side by side with one another, kind of intermingled communities, if you will. And different countries and different municipalities have different ways of dealing with this. Some want to encourage enclaves. Others work very hard to make sure that no enclaves are possible. My understanding is that, for example, in Singapore, because so much of the real estate is state-owned, they actually make it so that people who are coming from different countries can't cluster together, because they assign them to live separate from one another in order to prevent these sorts of enclaves. And so all these sort of high structural and meso-level organizational features have really, really important inputs for intergroup dynamics in psychology. And I would love to meet the person who told me who would tell me that they knew that without any of the data at hand.
Nice. I mean, I think what you bring home here as an argument is that behavioral science is about decoding the mechanics and the dynamics of society, right? And as you described, it's an interdisciplinary effort, because one of us, might be trained as a historian or anthropologist, but like bringing those different perspectives together to better understand the dynamics and the mechanics, And I wanted to turn to Andrés, because Andrés, you work basically as a practitioner and as a scholar, like oscillating between those worlds. And I wonder what you counter when you hear that skepticism, especially from often the practitioner side, that say, works nicely in the lab with 30 people, get a gift voucher to participate in a study, but doesn't work at scale with millions. The stakes are too high. So what do you answer those skeptics?
Yeah, for me, and I was checking out the questions, the great questions that our audience is kindly sharing with us. And I believe they go to the same place, right? First, I think what brain and behavioral sciences have brought to the table is the idea that we need to deviate from standard models of decision making, especially programming. And the UN is leading this with a quintet of change. I'm a great believer in that this 5-lever model can really make a difference, bringing in scientists, decision makers, practitioners, and the protagonists around the world to use data, to use innovation, to use cultural change in their organizations, and basically using that to make innovations that can be tested, adjusted, and basically being scaled up, right? So I think first, this idea that, and I love behavioral science because it's in a sense, a punk movement between the traditional ways of thinking about human behavior, is the idea that we need to embrace that imperfection or that imperfect nature that we have, that adaptive mechanisms that are responsible for our worst, but also for the greatest aspects of what we do around our lives and through our journeys. So I think that's great. And I think the World Bank started this movement with their special report in 2015 under the direction of the great economist Carla Hoff. They did great work because they started change, basically using experiments to understand what biases their own personnel, their own collaborators were engaging in development projects, especially in the global South. So I think that type of, like sobering type of approach is what we need right now. The UN is trying to do it, but we need to further it, right? And that's where this illusion of the ivory tower, that is the bias basically against scientists working in public policy, have been debunked by the exercises that the Obama government and then the UK government started with their notch units, and basically that they have been able to install this around the world to bring science, not only insights, but bringing the scientists to the field. And I think that collaboration is very important. Then about the funding, I think now, especially in my country, we're doing research from the universities is very difficult because we don't have really funds to do that. The collaboration with the private organizations that have a whole deal of social responsibility for tax reasons or for other reasons about their missions and their own businesses have become, at least for Neuropaz, as Machi was saying, and the job of the work we're trying to do in Colombia, is that we're finding that private sector is very interested in innovation, right? But what is the perfect way to start? Basically, from the human mind, its imperfections, but also to capacity of change. So someone in our chat was asking about, okay, so it's about education. It's, again, the same thing that we bring in with brain and behavioral science. Education needs to change to understand basically their assumptions about how people learn, why they learn, how we can keep it engaged, and basically what we're seeing, how we can incentivize them to understand that many of the aspects, and that what the old story that Emile Bruno used to told us, you know, he was a biology high school teacher, and he went, you know, to in the summers to work in some camps, kids in summer camps, you know, bringing together kids from different religious backgrounds in Ireland. And after being exposed to the traditional peace education type of approach, a big brawl broke up, and you know, all these kids were fighting, and he was asking himself, are we doing the right thing? Are we doing worse with this type of approaches? So I think, as Mina was saying, without the data and the strategies, we cannot do it, but also without getting the everyday protagonists engaged, especially public and private organizations, we won't be able to do that. And I think the world is understanding that.
And Mina, I see. I want to bring you in, but also with a question with regard to the future. You know, so imagine, and Andrés just sketched out, you know, the many questions we still have, the many things that are not that solved yet. You know, so if you know, imagine you get a big research grant, which, you know, I mean, knock on wood, probably happens, you know, or has happened, but there's even more funding available, more attention. Like, what would you invest it in? What do you think are the elements we need to focus on more when it comes to looking at behavioral science, you know, as an opportunity to advance the peace and security work?
Yeah, it's a great question. Before I get to that, I wanted to put another finger though on Andrés's point, which is that I think so much of what I see happening in practice is that oftentimes people aren't necessarily collecting the data to make sure that what they've done hasn't backfired, or there isn't a control condition, or they're not looking at the durability of their effects. Because one of the things that Emile really taught me was that after some of these summer programs with the kids, actually the potential for betrayal is so much worse. Because what you've done is you've established a relationship between people across two sides of a conflict divide. And now that they think that, well, the next time the conflict breaks out, I expect my friend from summer camp to call and make sure that my family and I are okay. But then they don't, because they're back with their family and they're back with their community, and they may feel pressure not to call. And actually that engenders even potentially more hostility than would have been there at baseline. I've heard other kinds of backfiring stories, which totally blew my mind. One of which was there was some promise of support in an inter-village skirmish, and I'm blanking on the location now, but it was herders and then sort of militiamen. And the NGO came in and said, oh, we're going to provide support. But in that cultural context, support typically meant cash transfers. But then they came in and did like meditation or something. And what ended up happening was that there was a government policy to actually provide cattle to disincentivize the militiamen from engaging in violence, in part because some of that was happening because of just the impoverished conditions of the community. But what ended up happening then for the victims of the violence, they had said, well, next time I know to pick up a gun, because instead of getting meditation, I'll at least get cattle. And so I think that there are these incredibly well-intentioned interventions, but I don't know that people have necessarily always thought through some of the unintended consequences of them. And that's another place that having really good documentation of both the immediate and long-term consequences of intervention is incredibly important. But coming back to what it is that I would do if given, you know, money started falling from the sky into my lap, one of the things I do find incredibly exciting is that we have access to data, potentially access to data. A lot of this is private data, but I do think it's incredibly interesting and will deeply inform how we think about collective behavior going forward in the social sciences. That what we really need to do is get a team of people who all have different backgrounds and expertise. This is kind of coming back to the point that you seized on, Martin, earlier at the end of my preceding answer. We want the historians, we want the sociologists, we want the cultural anthropologists, and of course, core to this team is local community members with the expertise of this particular conflict. Because again, I think what everybody's learning very quickly is that one size does not fit all when it comes to intervention, and as well as peace building and reconciliation, right? Different places are at different time points in their dynamic evolution of either pre-conflict, in conflict, post-conflict, or long-term reconciliation. And all of these different stages require different kinds of interventions. They require different kinds of, there are different processes that are playing out, whether people were firsthand victims of the violence versus being subsequent generations, children, or grandchildren. I mean, all of these things matter quite a lot, as well as the narrative that gets carried forward that then reorganizes people's beliefs about history and then further legitimizes or delegitimizes the conflict as it had happened historically. So the historians, the anthropologists, the local community members, but also the political scientists who understand elite to constituent dynamics much better than most, the psychologists who understand constituent to elite dynamics, and then of course also the computational social scientists who understand network dynamics, as well as the physicists who understand fission fusion models. All of these different approaches are going to be required to make any sense of these insane data sources we have, whether it's from cell phone data, social media data, large scale scraping of media, whether it's televised or print journalism, what have you. All of that, we could have all the data in the world, but if we don't have the right expertise and models to bring to bear on those data, we're just going to get garbage. And so in terms of trying to predict and characterize where different communities are in the evolution of their experiences of conflict, trying to figure out which communities are most likely to break out into conflict going forward, our models have to be smart and they have to be well informed by people who have complementary expertise from all of these different approaches. And so with my big pile of money, what I would do is I would try to start a seed project to bring people with this expertise to bear together in order to better understand if we could make predictions about which places would need which kinds of interventions, but also which places are just pre-conflict, whether it's linguistic cues, whether it's watching the behavior of private entities pull out of those regions as a potential way of flagging places that are becoming unstable. All of these different enterprises. And the reason I think that this is success, there was just an article in Vox last week on the INR, which is I did not know that this institution exists. Everybody knows who the CIA is, but the INR is the State Department's Bureau of Intelligence and Research, and apparently they have an incredible track record of predicting where conflict is going to break out and exactly when. And the large part, what it sets it apart from other kinds of State Department offices is that there is very deep knowledge and the people's appointments are long-lived. They're there for a long time. There's a potential there's actual structure for information to reach the same people. There's institutional knowledge and memory that is retained because there isn't so much turnover and churn in the people who are involved in making these predictions and trying to figure out these institutional, yes, thank you. So that is, that's the project that I would start a seed project for that. I would pick a particular region, I would bring in the physicists and everybody else, and then I would try to see what we could do there.
Andrés, over to you. What would you spend the money for? And we heard from Mina, convenings, and I wonder also what role technology can play. While Mina, you were describing the need to, bring in different voices. Just have every character be replaced by a chatbot. Where you have the whole institutional knowledge on country XYZ and theme XYZ. But Andrés, what are your thoughts looking at the future? What should we invest into?
Okay, first for me, I will put all my money on Mina's proposal. And specifically, what I would do is to bring something that one of our participants here was suggesting, and is the power of arts, and especially the power of storytelling, to confirm that this capacity that we have to predict, to model situations, and then to intervene them is real, right? Because as Mina was saying, we always know about the, like the controversial actors. We know specifically how science, data, and also entertainment is being used to numb society, to manipulate, and etc. We all know that, but we also know that there are great things, exciting things happening. For example, we have Sander van der Linden, who developed like this foolproof mechanism, and he's engaging with different actors, networks of communications, and not only public organizations but private organizations, to bring his model to get people to get the excitement of seeing that they can be wrong, right? At the beginning of this talk, my brain made me do a little Freudian slip. So I was, in a sense, pointing something to Casas saying that's really Danny Kahneman who said it, the perfect problem around climate change. And I would say our perfect problem basically is humanity. And in that sense, we know today that we have different measures to do that. And you said one, dear Martin, and we did, and we are doing a project in Colombia with you, Mina, Mache, and other colleagues, is bringing how VR can help us change basically those expectations that we have, those miscalculations, misconceptions that we have about the people who are far away from us in our reference networks, and specifically see how we can, through the power of narratives, change these behaviors. I've seen, and I have done a lot of work, trying to see the impact that cinema, that photography, that art exhibitions can have. But again, as Mina was saying, like in a naturalistic way, things can work, but we really have to try to pilot and test what works and what doesn't, because I think, and to end my points, context sensitivity, as Mina was saying, is very important. And I think that's the power also of behavioral science. I always tell my audiences and my people who I engage with is that behavioral and brain and behavioral science, or to do brain and behavioral science in an applied manner, is basically being kind of a comedian, because for comedy, it's very important context. And I think that is what we're lacking now. And I think that's where our superpower, using not tricks, not just behavioral nudges or etc., but bringing, as Mina was also signaling with her hands, bringing the scissors, the top down, the bottom up, and affecting organizational change to basically embed change in these reference networks, because people change with others. They don't change individually in order to make this stability. And I think art and entertainment are our superpower right now, because we are ultra connected. And I think that's where, and someone was asking us if we have some specific, like a cognitive immunology type of treatment to share with you. And I would say we have plenty now, thanks to work, for example, the work that Mina does and the great work many behavioral scientists do, but also the work that practitioners are doing around the world. For example, the Salima project in Africa, that has been incredible. The work that Mothers to Mothers have done also in Africa. We're seeing the power of getting people together, but we need to tell the story properly to show that we can change. And if people only see the bad behavior being posted all the time, our attention will focus and we will have our brains reacting in the way they were designed to work. That's basically to identify threats.
We have a few minutes left before we end this session, but I wanted to pick up, and Andrés has been very elegantly already picking up some questions from the audience, and thanks colleagues for posing those questions. So last round, Mina and Andrés. I'll start with Mina first. I'm going to read some of the questions out, and you pick and choose what you like to answer. We won't be able to answer all of those. And then at the very end, I hand back to Maciej to share some thoughts from his end and close it off. So Mina, a few questions here from the audience. Again, pick and choose what you like. One question about how to use behavioral science to influence funding decisions in fragile states. So that's a good one, actually, when it comes to how do we use the power of behavioral science to influence kind of international relations and international support. That's one question. There's another question on any research about neuron drivers and addiction patterns that violence and war can create, how people get addicted to violence in work. Any thoughts on that? Then there's a question about climate change, any lessons learned in that regard. One of the greatest challenges we are facing, a lot of people talk about, but little has been done, unfortunately, not enough, let's put it that way. And then there's a question about, working, and that's regard to high-level mediation and negotiation, working with leaders to make behavioral science applications effective to bring peace, and that's something we discussed actually in the last years, where we have a far too small sample size. Would you ever get would you get 30 presidents into an experiment? That would be wonderful, where we could then have an assessment of this high-level decision-making dynamic that we face. So Mina, over to you for some concluding thoughts, any of the questions you'd like to answer, and then I'll hand back to Andrés. Over to you, Mina.
Yes, thank you. And thank you all for those excellent questions. With respect to climate change, I'm incredibly concerned about the impact it will have on mobility, and then as well as resource constraint, and the possibility for conflict as a result. And so I think that what we have to do is keep a really close eye on those communities that are receiving disproportionately large amounts of migrants, either due to conflict or climate change or whatever pressure is causing people to have to leave their homes, violence of, state-based violence, what have you, and be really, really, really mindful about exactly where it is that these folks are going, because those are the places that I imagine will be powder kegs. And so, and the other thing that I only have been thinking about more and more recently is also how the greater mobility of even the upper and working classes moving to places that from where they do not hail, but that it's cheaper to live, and so now they're actually driving up the cost of living in those places and making it harder for residents who've lived there for many generations to continue to live there. All of these, so basically, from more impoverished to wealthier, but also from wealthier down to more impoverished communities, how those dynamics are going to cause greater and greater conflict within local communities. With respect to trying to figure out, so the last question was about leaders. People are doing this work now. So the Polarization Research Lab, which is based at UPenn and Dartmouth at Stanford, they're actually tracking the rhetoric of US politicians right now. And they're really looking, they're not only looking at what it is that people are saying. Historically, people have only had speeches that have been given on the congressional floor, but now we have the whole of social media. And so we can look at how it is the toxicity of the rhetoric that these leaders are putting out to the public, which people are consuming. They have access to it and they're paying a lot of attention to it, whether or not that actually helps them electorally in the next election. Because if it doesn't, then what we have now is top-down advice to disincentivize that kind of rhetoric. And that rhetoric has incredibly important implications for voter-to-voter interactions. And so again, getting a little bit more data about what the actual costs are and engaging what people think are good strategies, but are not potentially, is incredibly important to stem the tide of that kind of rhetoric. Yes, Martin.
Andrés, any thoughts on the questions raised from the audience? Climate change, toxicity, what comes to your mind?
Going a bit back to Danny Kahneman, there are the perfect problems. We can see them as they are, existential threats, and be paralyzed by that. Someone was asking about addiction basically to emotions, to mental models, to, these maladaptive cognitions that throw us into these being locked in bad behaviors, suboptimal equilibriums in societies using violence. Mina was saying a great example. We work a lot here in Colombia, Medellin, and Cartagena with the problem of people moving here to live very nicely in Colombia, but getting, creating these very perverse incentives, basically prostitution and other stuff that we're trying to work in. But we understand something. We need to basically focus on how the freeze response that we have and that basically jam us into this type of bad addictive behavior to what's bad and to toxicity. I think we have a lot of clues, and Mina was talking from the polarization field. We are learning a lot on how we can basically move people or freeze minds to change the way people consume information, the way they decide who should be your leader, etc. So these mega crisis that we are living, I think is the perfect moment and the perfect problem that we can tackle with this type of transitional applied brain and behavioral science research.
Amazing. Big thanks to our speakers. Full transparency here. We're using the cognitive nudge of scarcity to keep the appetite up. That's why we're keeping it to 60 minutes straight, so that you're still curious and about behavioral science. Again, big thanks to Mina and to Andrés for joining us in this conversation. Thanks to everybody who asked questions. Mace, are you still with us? Over to you for rounding us up and bringing us home.
Yes, I am. I'm trying to turn on my camera, but I cannot do that. I don't know why.
No problem.
Yeah, okay. But anyway, I must say that I'm really speechless and excited at the same time. Martin, exactly what you said. I could have listened to your discussion for another 2, 3, 4 hours, and I'm even considering Professor Mina to apply for your classes at the Harvard University to be able to engage in more discussion with you. Why I'm saying that? Because what is important for me and what I'm taking from this discussion is that very often in our professional life, we think that our intuition, our knowledge and experience are the answer to the situations that we are facing, that we are already well equipped to solve the conflicts, to build the resilience, to understand the conflict dynamics and counter terrorists even to some extent. But what we heard from you guys today, that only supported by science. And Professor Mina underlined it in the way that I started to comment to my colleagues who are with me here in the office, that like only with data, only with proper data, supported by data, entering the given context of the conflict, will be able to deconstruct this conflict to the level that we can really understand or pretend to understand what is going on there, and to prepare, organize interventions that are meaningful, and again that will not bring unintended consequences. So again, cultural intelligence, cultural awareness, where we are, what we do, because again, sometimes you have this tendency, I will not name the organization, that we are coming and we think that we know better than everyone else. No, only if we practitioners will join hands with academia, with experts, with scientists, we can really bring real change. So I'm super excited, and I will be really happy to continue the discussion. But Martin, over to you for the last word, and then I think the appetite are there. So we'll be receiving a lot of questions, maybe emails. During this session, I received tens of invitations to LinkedIn. So I think I will be receiving follow-up emails, guys, as well. So it's super nice. Thank you for this. It was very interesting and exciting. Thank you so much.
LinkedIn is a good reminder, colleagues out there. There is the UN 2.0 LinkedIn group where our colleagues from the United Nations Innovation Network and others are posting helpful resources. If you haven't tuned in other sessions, there are a few other sessions happening as part of the Behavior Science Week. All the sessions are recorded and made available. And as mentioned, don't be shy, reach out to us. And we hope to see you soon again. Big thanks again to Mina and Andrés. Have a wonderful day. Stay in touch. See you all soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Okay, guys. Bye-bye. Thank you.